In the early morning, before the city had fully woken, a boy stood at the threshold of his father's workshop and watched Sophroniscus was already at the stone, and he had been at it, probably since the light was barely enough to see by, his hands moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who had done this work so long that the doing of it had become indistinguishable from thinking. The workshop was cool. There was fine pale dust on everything, on the low workbench, on the handles of the mallets hung along the wall, on the floor where the chips had gathered at the base of the block like small white offerings. Sophroniscus pressed the iron chisel to the stone, then struck it, and the sound moved out through the open door and into the street. The stone resisted. Then, in the particular way stone has of accepting the inevitable, it gave, and a chip turned away from the block and fell. The boy watched this. He did not yet have words for what he was watching. No boy of 5 or 6 has the vocabulary for patient labor, for the practiced reading of a material's resistance, for the way a shape that does not yet exist can live in the mind of the person whose hands are about to find it. Those words come later, or they come in the form of other words, words that belong to a different kind of work. For now there was only the workshop in the early light, the smell of cut stone, the soft regular sound of iron on marble, and the quiet of a man completely at home in what he was doing. The boy's name was Socrates. He had been born in the Demia of Elapete, a neighborhood of Athens that sat just outside the city walls, in the year that later historians would record as 470 BCE. His father Sophroniscus was a stonemason. His mother Phaenareate was a midwife. These were not incidental facts about his parentage. They were, as Socrates himself came to understand, the original form of everything he would later become, the two vocations of his childhood home pressed into him early, like the impression of a seal into soft wax, and only much later recognized for what they had always been. Athens in those years was a city at the height of something. The Persian Wars were recent enough to still be vivid. The names of Marathon and Salamis were carried in living memory, not yet sealed inside the amber of schoolroom history. Pericles had been reshaping the city for a generation, raising the Parthenon and the Propylaea on the Acropolis, with a civic ambition so large that its physical forms still cast shadows across the lower streets. Everywhere there was the sense of a place that had survived catastrophe and had decided, with some urgency, to be magnificent. Trade moved through the port at Piraeus. Ships loaded and unloaded in the broad harbor. Citizens gathered in the assembly on the Pnyx Hill to vote on matters of law and war, and the conduct of public life, and the vote of each man was counted. The democracy was imperfect, built on the labor of enslaved people and the exclusion of women, but within its own terms, it was genuinely participatory in a way that struck visitors from other Greek cities with something between admiration and unease. Into this city, Socrates was born, and in this city he would spend his entire life. He never left it for any length of time, except to go to war when Athens called him. He would become, in the fullness of his years, the most closely identified human being in the history of philosophy, with a single place and a single practice, the city and the conversation, the agora and the question. But none of this was visible yet in the morning light of his father's workshop, where the stone was simply the stone, and the chisel was simply the chisel, and the man striking it was simply his father, doing what he had always done. Phaenareate moved through the household with the particular attentiveness of someone accustomed to being useful at the most critical moments. Midwifery in Athens was practical work, often urgent, always intimate, conducted in the private rooms of other people's homes at hours that did not respect the ordinary rhythms of day and night. Phanerete would have known how to wait, how to sit with a situation that was not yet resolved, and attend to it without forcing it toward a conclusion before it was ready. She would have known how to read the difference between what was happening and what needed to happen. She would have known that certain things could not be hurried, only accompanied. These were not philosophical insights. They were the accumulated practical knowledge of a woman who had attended many births. But they were the kind of knowledge that a particular kind of child, growing up in the household of someone who possessed it, absorbs without being aware of absorbing. Socrates absorbed it. He did not know, sitting on the floor of the workshop, or watching his mother leave before dawn for a confinement across the city, that he was receiving anything. Children rarely do. The philosophical metaphors that he would later build from his parents' vocations, the metaphor of the stonemason working hard material into its truest shape, the metaphor of the midwife drawing out what another person already carried within them, these did not arrive as sudden illuminations. They rose slowly, the way the first light rises, already present before it is visible, until one morning it simply is, and it seems as though it has always been. The Athens that shaped Socrates as a young man was a city in argument with itself about what speech was for. The sophists had come, from Protagoras of Abdera, who was perhaps the most celebrated of them, and from Gorgias of Leontini, who was the most rhetorically dazzling, and from Thrasymachus of Chalcedon and the others who followed in their wake. From all of them there had come, into the intellectual life of the city, a proposition that was difficult and useful, and as Socrates came to believe, dangerous. The sophists offered to teach the art of persuasion. For fees, sometimes very large fees, they would show a young man of good family how to argue effectively in the assembly, how to frame an accusation or a defense in court, how to make an audience believe that the position he was advocating was the right one. This was not, in itself, obviously dishonest. Public life required public speech, and public speech required skill, and skill required instruction. But the sophists went further, or at least the more radical among them did. Protagoras had offered the proposition that man was the measure of all things, that what was true for any given person was true for that person, and that there was no standard of truth that stood above the standards of the individuals doing the measuring. Gorgias had argued with theatrical brilliance that nothing exists, and if it did, it could not be known, and if it could be known, it could not be communicated. A set of claims that delivered with sufficient rhetorical skill produced in an audience the peculiar sensation of being persuaded of something they found impossible to believe. And across all of this there hung the practical question, never quite stated plainly, of whether the boundary between true speech and effective speech was a real boundary at all, or simply another convention, one more thing a skilled enough speaker could make appear to be wherever he needed it to be. This question was the water Socrates swam in as a young man. He did not avoid the sophists. He argued with them, or argued with their ideas, and in the dialogues that were later written about him, their voices appear again and again as the foil his thinking was sharpened against. The city's uncertainty about the relationship between persuasion and truth, about whether winning an argument and being right were the same thing or different things, this was not an abstract philosophical puzzle for Socrates. It was a civic emergency. A city that could not tell the difference between a well-constructed argument and a true one was a city whose collective decisions were being made on grounds that had nothing to do with the facts of the matter. A democracy that could be persuaded of anything by the right speaker was not really governing itself at all. It was being governed by whoever happened to speak best that day. This is the problem that will occupy Socrates for his entire life. But that life has not yet been fully formed, in these early years, and the problem is still gathering its shape. He grew into a man of unusual physical description. The dialogues, written by people who knew him, including Plato and Xenophon, agree on certain details. He was short and broad, with a flat nose and prominent eyes that several interlocutors described as giving him the slightly startled appearance of a fish or a satyr. He went barefoot in all weather. He dressed plainly, in a single garment, summer and winter, and seemed indifferent to physical comfort in a way that was both admired and faintly unsettling to people who prized the appearance of prosperity. He was strong. He could drink without visible effect, as several accounts confirm. He could stand without moving for hours when he was absorbed in thought. There is a story from the symposium in which he stood outside alone from dusk until dawn, working through some problem in his mind. And the soldiers who noticed him standing there in the early morning did not disturb him. He had been a soldier. Athens required it of its citizens, and Socrates went when he was called. He served in the long campaign at Potidæa in the cold northern Aegean, where the Athenians endured a siege that lasted several years. He served at Amphipolis, and he served at Delium in Boeotia in 424 BCE in the battle that ended with the Athenian army in panicked retreat across difficult ground. Retreats are among the most dangerous moments in ancient warfare. The moment an army turned its back and ran, discipline collapsed, the organized mass dissolved into individual frightened men, and the enemy pursued. Many more soldiers died in a panicked retreat than in the fighting that preceded it. The thing that protected a man in retreat was either luck or a quality almost impossible to manufacture: the ability to hold oneself in the middle of chaos at the center of one's own composure. Alcibiades, who served with Socrates at Delium and who would later give an account of his behavior in Plato's Symposium, describes Socrates walking from the field at his ordinary pace, not running, walking, and not the contracted, deliberate performance of someone trying to appear calm. Simply a man walking at the speed he ordinarily walked, with the same posture and the same composure he would have had in the agora, as though the noise and the panic and the danger were a weather that was present, but not for him, directive. Alcibiades said that the soldiers on both sides found themselves unwilling to touch him. He did not know how to explain this entirely, but the image he gave was of a man whose inner stillness was so complete and so visible that it functioned as a kind of protection, not because it changed the facts of the battlefield, but because it changed something in those who encountered it, made them uncertain how to proceed against someone who appeared to have already settled, quietly and without apparent distress, the question of what he was prepared to face. This is not philosophy in the abstract sense, but it is a philosophy being lived. And the Socrates who would spend his later decades asking questions in the agora was continuous with the Socrates who walked slowly out of a battlefield at his ordinary pace. The same indifference to self-preservation when the cost of self-preservation was something he considered more important. The same steadiness, the same refusal to be moved by anything that was not reason or genuine evidence. He had a family. He had been married to a woman named Xantippe, and they had children together, 3 sons, according to the dialogues, one of them still quite young at the time of Socrates' death. There is a tradition stretching back to ancient sources that Xantippe was difficult, quick to anger, prone to complaints. Some ancient writers made this a joke at her expense. Socrates, by most accounts, regarded her with equanimity, and when asked about the apparent difficulty of living with her, he said something along the lines of that someone who wanted to become skilled at dealing with people would do well to practice on the most demanding specimen available. Whether he meant this entirely seriously is, like many things about Socrates, not entirely clear. He walked through the city every day. He walked through the agora, the open marketplace that was the commercial and social center of Athens, ringed with colonnades and the stalls of craftsmen and the tables of money changers, crowded from morning until the midday heat drove people indoors. He did not lecture there. He had no school, no building, no fees, no fixed schedule, no prepared texts. He did not write anything, or at least nothing survives, and the tradition suggests strongly that he wrote nothing at all. What he did, every day, for decades, was talk to people. He positioned himself deliberately in the places where people naturally gathered, near the cobbler's stalls, in the shade of the colonnades, on the stone steps where citizens sat and talked through the middle part of the day. He talked to tradespeople and to politicians, to generals and to poets, to the young men of wealthy families who followed him around because there was something about his conversations that they found irresistible, and to whoever happened to stop and engage him when he asked what seemed like a simple question. He was not performing. He was not teaching a curriculum. He was conducting every day the practice that was his actual philosophical method, the direct, unscripted encounter with another living person, a specific human being with specific beliefs and specific gaps in their self-knowledge, who had agreed to talk with him and find out what happened when the conversation was allowed to go wherever the questions led. This insistence on the public, unscripted, and genuinely human character of the encounter was not incidental to Socratic philosophy. It was its essential condition, a philosophy of self-knowledge that retreated to a private study, where the philosopher could compose arguments without interruption and present them in their finished form to a passive reader, would have been for Socrates a kind of contradiction. The question of whether a person truly knows what they claim to know cannot be answered in private. It can only be answered in the moment when someone asks them to explain it, with specificity and honesty, and they discover in real time whether they can. Across the Athenian afternoon, the colonnades above the agora threw long shadows on the stone floor below. The Parthenon was visible from almost everywhere in the city, a fact of the Athenian landscape that no citizen could ignore, white and complete on the rock of the Acropolis, the civic achievement of the Periclean age made permanent in marble. Down in the streets below it, the sophists in their fine cloaks moved between private houses and public gatherings, accepting invitations, collecting fees, performing the demonstrations of rhetorical skill that attracted the ambitious sons of wealthy families. Their trade was real, their service was practical. The men who learned from them became more effective in public life, more capable of winning arguments, more persuasive in the courts and the assembly. Whether they became wiser, whether they came any closer to understanding the things they were so confidently talking about, was a different question. It was, in fact, the question. In all of this, Socrates occupied an unusual position. He was not a sophist. He would later be accused of being one, and the confusion or deliberate misidentification contributed to the trouble that found him in the end. But he charged no fees. He offered no instruction in rhetoric. He made no claims to teach anyone anything, insisting instead, with disconcerting persistence, that he himself knew nothing, that what he was doing in these conversations was not teaching but inquiring, and that whoever he was talking with was not his student but his partner in an investigation whose outcome was genuinely uncertain. This last claim was the one his contemporaries found most difficult to take at face value. The conversations had a way of going in a consistent direction, and the consistent direction was toward the discovery that the person Socrates was talking with did not know what they thought they knew. This happened often enough, and to enough people of significant reputation, that it strained credulity to maintain that Socrates was not doing it on purpose. There is a scene in the Apology, the formal speech Socrates delivered at his trial, in which he describes going after the oracle at Delphi had pronounced that no one was wiser than Socrates, to test this claim against the reputations of the wisest men in Athens. He went to the politicians, who spoke with great confidence about justice and the public good. He went to the poets, who had written things of obvious beauty and power. He went to the craftsmen, who genuinely possessed skilled knowledge of their craft. And in each case he found that, while the politicians had opinions, and the poets had inspiration, and the craftsmen had genuine expertise in their particular art, none of them had what he was looking for, a clear, accountable understanding of why the things they were claiming to know were true, tested against the possibility that they might not be. But this is already slightly ahead of the story. What belongs here, in the early account of the man before his philosophy had fully crystallized in the historical record, is the image of the practice itself, the daily, patient, genuinely curious engagement with whoever was willing to sit or stand and talk, conducted not behind closed doors, but in the open air of the city's busiest place, subject to the noise and interruption and ordinary human friction of public life. He paused, sometimes mid-conversation. It was a thing people noticed about him. He would be in the middle of a thought or the middle of a question, and he would stop, his head tilting slightly, his attention turned briefly inward, as though he were listening to something below the immediate noise of the market. The stillness lasted a few seconds, sometimes longer, and then he would resume, as though the interruption had not occurred, picking up the thread of the conversation at exactly the point where he had left it. Plato describes this phenomenon in several dialogues. In the Apology, and in the Phaedrus, and in the Theaetetus, Socrates refers to it himself, a kind of inner signal that he called his daimonion, a divine something, an internal voice, or intimation that occasionally intervened in his deliberations. He was careful in how he described it. He did not claim that it told him what to do. He said more precisely that it sometimes told him what not to do, that it functioned as a restraint rather than an instruction, a signal that some further thinking was needed before a course of action was committed to. It was not, he insisted, a rival to reason. It was a call to keep reasoning, a notice that something in the situation had not yet been fully considered. The citizens of Athens who observed these pauses would have understood the category, if not the specific phenomenon. Their clerics took the internal as well as the external seriously. They would not have laughed necessarily at the idea that a man might receive a kind of sign. What they might have found strange or unsettling was the particular way Socrates talked about it, with such careful specificity, such philosophical precision, such apparent indifference to how it sounded to the people around him, who had their own ideas about what the gods communicated and how. He described his daimonion as part of his philosophical practice, not as a separate religious experience. It was woven into the thinking, not above it or beside it, and it was consistent, in this as in everything else, with the broader picture of a man who had arranged his inner life with great care. Around him the agora continued its business. The morning's argument about a disputed property boundary near the Piraeus had drawn a small crowd at one end of the colonnade. A ship captain from Corinth was negotiating at a money changer's table. Two women argued politely about the price of wool at a stall near the entrance. Somewhere across the open ground, in the shade near the Stoa of Zeus, 3 or 4 young men sat talking with the kind of intensity that belongs to people who have recently discovered that the world might be more complicated than they had assumed and have not yet found this worrying. The Parthenon stood above all of it, white and complete, throwing its particular authority over the city. Phidias had supervised the sculptures on its frieze, the procession of Athenian citizens rendered in stone, carrying their offerings toward the goddess, moving in the particular arrested motion that ancient Greek sculptors understood better than almost anyone who followed them. Not frozen, but on the edge of movement, permanently becoming. Below, the city moved through its actual transactions, its actual arguments, its actual days. Somewhere in that crowd, a man was turning towards someone he had never spoken with, and asking what seemed, from the outside, like a perfectly ordinary question. The question was about a word the other person had just used with complete confidence, a word about justice, or virtue, or the correct conduct of public life. The question was simple, it was entirely genuine, and no one watching would have had any reason to believe that it was anything other than what it appeared to be: 2 people in a marketplace, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, beginning an ordinary conversation. No one standing near enough to hear would have known that the question being asked, in one form or another, had not yet been answered, and would not be answered before the man asking it was dead, and would continue to be asked in his name, in his city's name, in the name of whatever he was doing in that colonnade, on that afternoon, for longer than the city itself survived, longer than the empire that eventually absorbed it, longer than the language that the question was first asked in, carried forward by the habit of inquiry that a specific human being had established in a specific place, a short man in a plain garment, barefoot on the warm stone of the agora, asking what the other person meant exactly by the word they had just used. The sun moved across the stone floor of the colonnade. The city made its particular noise, the sound of many people going about the business of being alive in a prosperous democracy in the middle of an afternoon that seemed from the outside like any other. The Parthenon held its position on the Acropolis above, as it had held it for 2 decades, as it would hold it for centuries more. The birds that nested in the eaves of the Stoa of Zeus moved in and out of shadow. The money changers counted, and in the middle of it all, unhurried, apparently without agenda, apparently without the specific gravity that the rest of the story would give him, a man stood talking with another man, asking a question that the other man had not expected to find difficult, and would find more difficult the longer they stood there, and would not have finished finding difficult for the rest of his life, or for the long life of anyone after him who encountered it in the same honest way that it was first asked. The question was still open. It would remain open through the afternoon, through the cooling evening when the agora emptied and the stone gave back its stored warmth to the air, through all the years and centuries that gathered themselves around it afterward, like a city around a well. The man who asked it did not know yet that he would become the question, that his name and the practice of asking would become inseparable, that the very idea of a question asked in full seriousness without a predetermined answer would carry, in the language of the tradition that grew from this city and this century, the sound of a barefoot man in a plain garment, standing in an agora in Athens, waiting with unhurried patience to hear what the other person believed they knew. The city hummed, and argued and transacted and argued again, and somewhere at the center of it all, between a cobbler's stall and a stone step worn smooth by generations of feet, an ordinary afternoon held, without knowing it, the beginning of something that would long outlast every stone of the city that held it. A man was walking quickly through the agora, his good sandals raising a small trail of dust on the packed stones. He had been to court before. He knew how these things went. He had a prepared answer, a position he had thought through carefully, a word he had used many times with complete confidence, and he was using it now in passing to explain to a companion why he was doing what he was doing. The word was piety. He knew what it meant. He had always known. He did not see Socrates step out from beside a stall selling fresh oil. The approach was quiet. The voice was quieter still, not challenging, not announcing itself as a challenge. What Socrates said, with what appeared to be the genuine curiosity of someone who has simply missed something and needs it explained, was that he had overheard the word just now, and that he found he was not entirely sure what it meant, and that since this man clearly understood it so well, would he mind pausing for a moment, only a moment, to explain it to someone who did not. This was how it began, almost always. The man's name was Euthyphro. He was a priest and a prophet, a man professionally occupied with the sacred, and he had just agreed to prosecute his own father for impiety. He was not uncertain about any of this. He was not the kind of man who tended toward doubt. When Socrates expressed apparent amazement at his confidence and asked to be taught, genuinely taught, the voice said, by someone who truly knew, Euthyphro relaxed into the conversation without noticing that he had done so. This was part of what Socratic questioning was. The relaxing was not accidental. What Euthyphro did not yet know was that neither he nor Socrates would leave the conversation in the same condition they had entered it. He offered his first definition. Piety, he said, was doing what he was doing right now, prosecuting wrongdoing, even in one's own family, as the gods themselves had done. Socrates received this with what looked like admiration, and then slowly, with the patience of someone genuinely working something out, began to ask whether a single example could serve as a definition, whether piety was the thing Euthyphro was doing, or whether piety was some quality shared by everything pious, including the thing Euthyphro was doing, which would make the example less than the answer. Euthyphro tried again. He offered a second definition, then a third. Each one arrived with a little less certainty, a little more care, as though he had begun to notice that the floor was not as solid as it had been. The second collapsed against a question about whether the gods all agreed. The third dissolved when Socrates drew out that it had quietly assumed the very thing it was supposed to explain. By the time the fourth attempt had come apart in his hands, Euthyphro said he had somewhere to be, gathered his robes, and left. He had not learned the definition. Neither had Socrates. That was not a failure. That was the whole point. There is a word for what happened between them, a Greek word used for the method Socrates applied in nearly every dialogue, in every dusty corner of the agora, with aristocrats and craftsmen and generals and poets alike. The word is elenchus. It means, in its oldest sense, examination, or more precisely, cross-examination. The kind of examination that is not satisfied with the first answer or the second, but that follows each answer to where it leads, and then follows that, until the conversation arrives at either genuine understanding or the honest acknowledgement that genuine understanding has not yet been found. The elenchus was the instrument. The agora was where Socrates used it, freely, on anyone who was willing to stay. What made it devastating? And it was devastating in the way that careful and patient work can be devastating when applied to something that has been held in place by something other than thought, was that it never operated from outside the interlocutor's own commitments. Socrates did not arrive with a competing position. He did not announce that Euthyphro was wrong and offer a better theory of piety. He began with what Euthyphro believed, and followed it forward, drawing out its consequences step by careful step, until those consequences collided with other things Euthyphro also believed, or until the definition arrived somewhere it had not intended to go. The collapse, when it came, was not imposed from outside, it arose from within. The argument did not break the interlocutor. The argument showed the interlocutor where their own thinking, followed honestly, led. This was why it felt so personal. This was why Meno, the wealthy Thessalian nobleman who arrived in Athens with perfectly arranged opinions about virtue, eventually compared Socrates to a stingray, a flat fish that numbs everything it touches, leaving limbs senseless and unable to move. Meno was embarrassed by this. He had given speeches about virtue before large audiences. He had been praised for his understanding. He arrived at the conversation certain he could answer the question easily, and he tried 3 times, each attempt careful and considered, and each time Socrates followed the answer to where it led, and the answer came apart. The 3rd attempt failed in the same way as the first. The numbness Meno described was real, but the stingray image, whatever Meno intended by it, tells something true. Before the numbness, there is sensation, and the sensation comes first, because something has been touched that was previously untouched. The 3rd definition sits in the dialogue like a stone that has been turned over to reveal what was living underneath it. Meno said that virtue was the desire for beautiful things and the power to obtain them. Socrates asked whether anyone desired bad things. Meno said no. Surely people who pursue bad things believe those things are good. Socrates accepted this, and then asked whether, if everyone desires what they believe to be good, then the desire for good things cannot distinguish the virtuous from the non-virtuous. The difference must lie entirely in the power to obtain them. But if that is so, Socrates continued, then virtue would just be a kind of effectiveness, and effectiveness in the service of injustice would count as much as effectiveness in the service of good. Meno stopped. The silence in the room was not the silence of someone searching for a better answer. It was the silence of someone who has looked down and seen that the floor is not where they expected it to be. What Meno encountered in that silence has its own name too, aporia, from the Greek for without passage, a state of genuine impasse, of having arrived at a place where the path that seemed to lead forward has closed, and the path back would only lead to the same closure. And the honest position is to acknowledge that one does not know where one is standing or which direction forward lies. Aporia was not for Socrates a symptom of failure. It was the destination. It was the state he was trying to bring people to, not past, because in his understanding of inquiry, aporia was the only honest ground from which genuine inquiry could begin. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The conversations that ended in aporia were not abandoned conversations. They were the successful ones. The conversation with Euthyphro ends without a definition of piety, and this is the best thing that could have happened to Euthyphro if he had been willing to stay with it, because before the conversation he held a false certainty in the place where genuine understanding might have grown, and after it, had he allowed himself to remain at the threshold he had reached, he would have held an honest not knowing, which is the necessary beginning of real thought. The difficulty is that honest not knowing is uncomfortable in a way that false certainty is not, and Euthyphro, like most people, found the discomfort a reason to leave rather than a reason to stay. There is a particular quality to the moment of aporia in a Socratic dialogue, even reading it centuries later from a quiet room. The interlocutor has been moving through the conversation with the confidence of someone walking familiar terrain. The questions have been friendly, the progress has seemed genuine, and then something shifts, not suddenly, but with a kind of slow inevitability, the way light changes before a storm, the quality of it different before any cloud has appeared. A definition that seemed solid is found to produce a consequence no one wants to accept. A distinction that seemed to organize everything is shown to organize nothing, or to assume what it was supposed to demonstrate. The interlocutor stopped speaking, not searching for a better formulation, simply stopped, the way water stops when it reaches the edge of a vessel. What is on the other side of that stopping is the question. Socrates himself occupied the same position. This is the part of his intellectual practice that is easiest to misread, because the posture of ignorance he maintained throughout his conversations could look, from certain angles, like a performance, like a man who actually knows the answer, feigning confusion in order to maneuver an opponent into a trap. The dialogues have passages that make this reading tempting. Socrates is too skilled at the questions, too consistently the one who does not find himself refuted, to seem entirely without resources, and yet the evidence taken seriously points somewhere else. In Plato's Apology, the text that records Socrates' speech to the Athenian jury at his own trial, he tells the story of how he came to understand his own situation. The oracle at Delphi had said through the medium of Chaerephon that no one was wiser than Socrates. Socrates found this perplexing. He did not believe himself to be wise. He set out to disprove the oracle by finding someone wiser than himself, beginning with the politicians, then the poets, then the craftsmen. What he discovered in each case was that those with genuine expertise in their craft also believed themselves to possess knowledge beyond their craft, about justice, about beauty, about the good, knowledge they did not actually have. The politicians could not account for their political judgments. The poets could not explain what their poems meant. The craftsmen, skilled and capable in their work, had allowed their skill to convince them they understood things they did not understand. And Socrates noticed that in each case this second, unearned confidence had been invisibly attached to the first, genuine expertise, and the person could not feel the difference. What the oracle had meant, he concluded, was something precise. His advantage over these men was not that he knew more than they did about the great questions. It was that he knew he did not know, and they did not know they did not know. The knowledge of one's own ignorance is a real epistemic state. It is not nothing. It is, in fact, a form of clarity, a way of holding the landscape honestly, without the distorting pressure of beliefs held without basis, the false structures that make a mind feel settled and occupied and safe while keeping actual inquiry from getting started. This distinction runs through everything Socrates did in the dialogues. On one side, epistemo, genuine knowledge, stable, accountable, able to withstand examination, able to explain not just what is true, but why it is true. On the other, doxa, opinion, which may sometimes happen to be correct, but is held without understanding of why, without the capacity to explain or defend, or trace the reasoning that would support it. The danger of doxa is not that it is usually wrong. It may be right, and often is. The danger is that it feels identical, from the inside to knowledge. The person who holds a correct opinion and the person who holds genuine knowledge both feel certain. The difference only appears when the question begins. The craftsmen in the Apology are the clearest illustration. Their skill was real. Socrates acknowledged this explicitly, with what seems like genuine admiration. He could not do what they could do, and he did not pretend otherwise. But skill in making does not produce understanding of beauty, or of the good, or of what a just city requires. The craftsman's error was not in possessing their skill, it was in the invisible extension of it. the quiet assumption that competence in one domain licenses confidence in every domain, and the fact that this extension was invisible to them was precisely what made it dangerous. Socrates could feel the difference because he had spent his life looking for it. The craftsmen could not, because they had never been given occasion to look. It's the dialogue in which the problem of inquiry appears in its sharpest form is the minnow, and it appears not through an argument that Socrates makes, but through one that Minnow makes, almost as a provocation. Minnow has just watched his third definition collapse. He is frustrated and possibly a little stung, and he asks Socrates how inquiry can even be possible. If you do not know what you are looking for, he says, you would not recognize it if you found it. But if you already know it, there is nothing to look for. Either way, searching is useless. Either way, the question cannot be pursued. The argument is compact, and it is serious, not a sophist's trick, but a genuine logical knot, the kind that stays tied the more carefully you try to undo it. Socrates responds with the theory of recollection. He does not dismiss the paradox. He accepts its force and offers an account that, if true, would dissolve it without denying either of its premises. The soul, Socrates proposes, has not simply begun to exist at the moment of a person's birth. It has existed before. It has been in contact with what is eternal and true, with the forms of things as they actually are, not as they appear in any particular instance, and what appears to be learning is not the acquisition of genuinely new information, but the recovery of what was already there, buried beneath the distraction of bodily existence, waiting to be drawn out by the right questions. Inquiry is possible because it is not a journey into the entirely unknown. It is a return. He demonstrates this not with another argument, but with a scene. A slave boy with no formal education is brought into the dialogue. Socrates draws a square in the ground. He asks the boy a series of questions about it, not telling him anything, not explaining, only asking, and the boy, working through the questions with growing care and occasional correction of his own errors, arrives at a geometric truth he had no obvious means of knowing in advance. He is not told the answer, he finds it, or, in the language of the theory, he recovers it from somewhere inside, or from somewhere deeper than inside, from some previous contact with the eternal proportions that make the geometry possible. The scene is not presented as proof. Socrates offers it as evidence for a possibility, not a certainty. What it does is make the theory of recollection feel like something other than a fanciful story. It makes it feel like something a person could observe, even if only indirectly, even if only as a shadow of what might be happening at a deeper level. And whatever one thinks about the metaphysical claim underneath it, the scene has a quality that the dialogues often have at their best: the sense of genuine discovery happening in real time, the feeling that the slave boy is not being walked through something already known, but is genuinely finding something, the particular quality of his attention as the geometry becomes clear, the difference between his third answer and his first. What the slave boy's geometry lesson does for the Menno's paradox is this: it suggests that the dichotomy Menno has presented, either you know it completely or you know nothing about it, misses a third possibility. There is something in between knowing and not knowing. There is the state of having a felt sense that pulls toward the right answer, of holding an implicit understanding that needs only to be made explicit, of being able to recognize the answer when it comes even without having been able to produce it independently. Whether or not one accepts the metaphysical explanation Socrates offers, the observation underneath it is honest. Learning rarely feels like receiving something from outside. It more often feels like discovering something that was waiting to be found. This is the state the Elenchus is designed to move people toward. not toward answers, but toward the right relationship to questions. The false certainty has to come down first. The structures built from opinion, held without understanding, from confidence borrowed from expertise in adjacent domains, from the social expectation that a person in one's position should know certain things. All of this has to be cleared before genuine inquiry has room to begin. The Alentius does not clear it gently. It follows the thought where it actually goes, and the collapse is the thought itself, discovering its own limits. This is why it feels personal. The questioner is not attacking the person. The thought is encountering its own boundary. There is a subtlety in Socratic irony that the later tradition has sometimes flattened into something simpler than it was. The Greek word ironia describes a posture of self-deprecation, of presenting oneself as less than one is, and in the dialogues this posture is genuine in a complicated way. When Socrates says he knows nothing, he is not performing false modesty as a rhetorical move while privately holding a set of confident views he is unwilling to share. He is expressing a genuine epistemic position with precise content that he does not have episteme, genuine knowledge, about the great questions, the nature of justice, of piety, of courage, of the good, and that anyone who claims to have it can be shown, through patient examination, to hold something less. The irony is genuine rather than merely strategic, because the ignorance is genuine. The performance of ignorance conceals nothing. It is what is there. And yet the posture has a practical dimension that Socrates was surely aware of. A man who announces that he is about to prove you wrong invites defensiveness, and defensiveness closes the mind against exactly the kind of examination the Alentius requires. A man who says he is confused and in need of instruction invites a kind of generosity, a willingness to explain, to expand, to demonstrate one's knowledge. And in that posture of generous explanation, the interlocutor's beliefs become visible in a way they would not be if the conversation had begun adversarially. Euthyphro would not have offered his definition of piety if he had suspected it was about to be examined. He offered it because he believed he was helping someone who did not know. Socratic humility, genuine or performed or both at once, opened the space the examination needed. And what the examination found, consistently, was not that the interlocutors were foolish people who had thought carelessly. Most of them had thought. Most of them had considered positions and reached conclusions and had reasons of a kind for what they held. What they had not done was follow those reasons to where they led, with the full rigor and patience the Alentius required. The result was not that they were wrong, or not only that, and not always, but that they were holding their beliefs at a shallower depth than the questions deserved, and the shallowness had been invisible to them, because depth, unlike surface, is hard to see from the surface. There is a passage in the Apology that contains, in a single sentence, the most precise formulation of what Socratic intellectual humility actually claims. Socrates says that his small advantage over the man who has just been examined, the politician, the poet, the craftsman, is that where the man knows nothing and believes he knows, Socrates knows nothing and believes he does not know. The structure of this is exact. Both positions sit in ignorance about the great questions. The difference is in the relationship to that ignorance, one transparent to itself, one opaque. This transparency is what Socrates calls wisdom when he uses that word carefully, not the possession of answers, the accurate perception of where answers have not yet arrived. In the cool room where Menno has just watched his third definition dissolve, there is a quality of silence that is different from the silence of someone thinking. It is the silence of someone who has reached the end of what thinking, in its current form, can provide. who has followed every path that seemed to open and found each one closing, not through any error of individual reasoning, but through some more fundamental difficulty in the question itself. This silence is aporia. It is not defeat. It is the first honest moment of the conversation. Before the conversation, Menno thought he knew what virtue was. He had said so, cheerfully, in the opening exchange, offering to list the varieties of virtue as though the question were a matter of inventory. He was not being careless. He genuinely believed this. The belief was comfortable and had never needed to be more than comfortable, because no one had ever followed it forward with sufficient patience to find where it stopped holding together. After the conversation, after the third definition, the silence, the numbness he described, he no longer has the comfort of that certainty. What he has instead is the honest acknowledgement that the question is harder than he thought, that the answer is not yet in his possession, and that he is, for the first time, genuinely standing in front of the question, rather than behind a position about it. This is what Socrates meant by the claim that the unexamined life is not worth living, a claim he made not as a philosopher in a quiet study, but standing before a jury that was deciding whether to execute him. Stripped of its dramatic context, the claim can sound like an overstatement, a philosopher's rhetorical flourish, the kind of thing one says to elevate one's own practice. Heard in its context, it is something more precise. Socrates was arguing that a life in which beliefs are held without examination, in which certainty accumulates without having earned itself through the friction of genuine inquiry, is a life spent not in the territory of understanding, but in a comfortable construction that resembles it from a distance. Not wicked, not even particularly wrong, much of the time, but shallow in a way that prevents the person from ever knowing how shallow it is, which is the most permanent kind of shallowness. The examined life, on this account, is not the life of someone who has arrived at better answers. It is the life of someone who has learned to take the question seriously, to stay at the aporia rather than retreating into the nearest available certainty, to hold the not knowing without immediately filling it, to resist the very human impulse to close a question before it has been genuinely opened. What Socrates offers is not a path out of uncertainty. He offers a way of inhabiting uncertainty that is more honest and, in his view, more dignified than the alternative. The slave boy in the Menno arrives at a geometric truth through questioning. He cannot, at the end, fully reconstruct the chain of reasoning that brought him there. He knows the answer more firmly than he knew it before the conversation began, but he does not yet have episteme. He cannot prove it from first principles, cannot defend it against all possible objections, cannot make it fully transparent to another person. What he has is something in between, a correct belief, more firmly held, tested a little against examination, more genuinely his own than it was before. Socrates acknowledges this as progress. It is not where the inquiry ends. It is where the inquiry, having started honestly, can actually go somewhere. The Olympians moved this way, forward from honest positions, through patient examination, toward states that were not yet knowledge, but were less far from it than they had been. The destination was not guaranteed. Many conversations ended in aporia and stayed there, the interlocutor departing, the question remaining, the inquiry unfinished. Socrates did not regard this as a problem with the method. He regarded it as the nature of the questions. Some questions are hard in a way that resists resolution, not because the inquirers have been insufficiently clever, but because the questions are genuinely difficult in themselves, because piety and justice and virtue and the good are not simple matters awaiting the right formulation, but real features of a difficult world that require a whole life of attention and still do not fully yield. What Socrates knew, or believed he knew, in the end, was that this was not a reason to stop asking. The aporia was not the wall, it was the threshold. On one side of it, the comfortable construction, the position held without examination, the certainty that has never needed to earn itself. On the other, the genuine difficulty, the open question, the not knowing that is not empty, but is at least clear about what it is. The threshold itself is cleared ground. The false structure has come down. The question, stripped of the answers it had been given too quickly, stands in the open air exactly as hard as it actually is, available for the first time to be genuinely approached. This is where Socratic dialogue arrived, again and again, in the agora and in the dialogues, and in every exchange between a careful question and an honest interlocutor. Not at a conclusion, not at a doctrine, at the open ground where the conclusion had not yet been earned, and the honest acknowledgement of that fact was itself a kind of beginning, the only kind that might, with patience, lead somewhere that would hold. The cleared ground has a quality of its own. It is not comfortable in the way that false certainty is comfortable, but it has a different quality, harder to name, the particular stillness of something that has stopped pretending to be what it is not, that is simply what it is, that asks for nothing from the person standing on it, except the willingness to stay. The question rests there, not demanding resolution, not pressing for an answer that has not been found, simply remaining in the open as questions do when the structures built to contain them have come down and they have finally been allowed to be the size they actually are. In the Apology, Socrates describes the oracle's answer as something he turned over for years before he understood it. Not a revelation, not a command, just a quiet, maddening claim that he of all people was the wisest man in Athens, a claim he found, upon first hearing it, completely impossible to believe. He stands before the jury of 501 Athenians and tells this story without theater, his voice holding the particular steadiness of someone recounting a thing that cost him a great deal, and from which he has long since recovered enough to see it plainly. The story begins at Delphi, but it does not stay there. It moves back through years of conversations, through the houses of poets and politicians and craftsmen, through every encounter in which he set out to disprove the oracle, and found, each time, that he could not. The temple at Delphi stood on the lower slope of Mount Parnassus, cut into the rock face, its carved inscription facing every person who climbed the stone path to consult the god. Gnothi seoton, know thyself. Know thyself. 2 words in Greek, cut into the threshold, worn pale by centuries of hands that may or may not have paused to consider what they meant. The phrase had been there long before Socrates. Other people had walked past it. Generals had walked past it on the way to ask about campaigns, and kings on the way to ask about heirs, and ordinary Athenians on the way to ask about ships and harvests and the fates of sons sent abroad. And then the oracle gave Socrates his answer, and he went home and began, very slowly and with considerable difficulty, to take the inscription seriously. What he found when he took it seriously was not what most people mean when they speak of knowing themselves. He was not looking for preferences or patterns, not cataloging his memories or tracing the shape of his character as a painter traces a face. What he was doing was harder and more specific than that. He was asking what he actually knew, in the strict sense, what he could give a proper account of, what would hold under questioning, what he could distinguish from mere opinion or habit or assumption, worn smooth by repetition until it felt like knowledge. This was not introspection as ease or solace, it was examination, and the first thing it yielded, consistently and without exception, was how much he did not know that he had believed he did. The word he used for this posture, Ironeia, has come down through the centuries, wearing a meaning it did not originally carry. Irony, as it is generally understood now, implies a distance between what is said and what is meant, a tone of detachment that signals the speaker's superiority to their own statement. Socrates' ironia was something different, and its difference matters. When he approached a general and expressed genuine admiration for the man's expertise and courage, and then asked, in the most sincere seeming way, whether the general might help him understand what courage actually is, he was not performing a distance from himself. He was performing a closeness to his own ignorance. The deference was real in the sense that Socrates genuinely did not know the answer he was asking toward. The apparent weakness was genuine, and this is what made the posture not a trick, but a method, and what made its ambiguity felt rather than merely described. When the general settled in to answer, his guard lowered by the apparent simplicity of the request, and began to speak with confidence about standing firm in battle, or facing danger without flinching. Something had already been set in motion that the general had not yet noticed. Not a trap exactly, more like a clearing. A space had been opened in which the general's belief about what he knew was allowed to walk forward on its own and demonstrate its own stability, or its lack of it. Socrates had made himself small enough that the other man's certainty felt safe to expand into the conversation, and once it had expanded fully, its seams became visible in the light. He adopted this posture not because he enjoyed the advantage it gave him. The dialogue suggests he adopted it because it was the only way to get people to think, rather than simply to perform thinking in front of someone they suspected wanted to correct them. He was walking through the agora in his 70s, barefoot as he had been nearly always, his cloak unwashed, his face carrying the particular quality of attention that his companions had long since stopped finding unsettling, but which strangers still noticed immediately, and the question he carried was not new. He had been carrying some version of it since the oracle's answer had sent him out into the city to test its claim. The question was this: whether there was a way to live that required constant examination of one's own beliefs as a condition of living it honestly, not examination as occasional review, not the kind of audit one performs when something has gone wrong, examination as the continuous, daily, unavoidable practice of a life that takes itself seriously at all. This is what he meant by the claim in the apology that the unexamined life is not worth living. The statement has been quoted so often that it has taken on a certain abstracted grandeur lifted from its original context and set in the kind of frame reserved for ancient wisdom. But it was not delivered from a safe distance. It was delivered in a courtroom to the jury that was about to decide whether he would live or die, as part of his argument for why he could not stop doing what he had always done. It was not a preference. It was not a philosophical principle he had adopted on reflection and could lay down on grounds of self-preservation if the circumstances required it. He was telling them that to abandon philosophy in exchange for his life would be not a compromise, but a kind of death of a different order, the death of the life that made his continued breathing worth anything at all. The silence that followed a Socratic question had its own texture. Euthyphro knew what it felt like. He was a young man of considerable religious confidence, an expert, as he saw it, in matters of piety, hurrying toward the courthouse to prosecute his own father for impiety in a case that he believed he understood completely. Socrates met him there, Or perhaps Socrates was simply present, and Euthyphro arrived and expressed admiration for Euthyphro's evident expertise in divine matters. He said he needed help. He said there was a charge against him involving impiety, and that a man of Euthyphro's knowledge could surely explain to him exactly what piety was. The request was perfectly simple. Euthyphro was happy to oblige. His first answer came easily. Piety is doing what he is doing now, prosecuting wrongdoing regardless of who has committed it. Socrates thanked him and asked whether this was an example of piety or a definition of it, since a definition would need to cover all cases of pious action and not just one. Euthyphro revised. Piety is what is dear to the gods. Socrates noted that the gods in the traditional stories disagreed with one another about almost everything, which meant the same action might be both dear and hateful, depending on which god was consulted. Euthyphro revised again. Piety is what all the gods agree is dear to them. Socrates raised a question about whether the gods loved pious things because they were pious, or whether things became pious because the gods loved them. And here the ground opened. Euthyphro found himself unable to say, with any coherence, which of these he meant, and the two options between them seemed to close off every definition he might reach toward. The dialogue ends with Euthyphro gathering his robes and departing, the definition still missing, the question still open. He does not slam a door. He does not accuse Socrates of deliberately ruining his case or his confidence. He says something vague about having to go, that they can speak another time, and leaves. What he leaves is the conversation unfinished, which may be the most honest ending any Socratic dialogue ever reached. He found the edge of what he thought he knew, and instead of stepping across it into genuine uncertainty, he stepped back into the afternoon and continued toward the courthouse, where he intended to prosecute his father for impiety, a word he had just been unable to define. The experience of reaching that edge had a name, though Socrates did not use it often as a label. It was enough that the thing itself occurred, the moment when the interlocutor stopped reaching for a better answer, because the ground beneath the question itself had become uncertain. Euthyphro did not stop because he had run out of definitions. He stopped because the definitions he had were not definitions at all. What he had were convictions, formed early, reinforced by his community, confirmed by his own feelings of certainty whenever he rehearsed them. They had always felt like knowledge. They had never before this conversation been asked to demonstrate that they were. Minnow, the Thessalian nobleman who argued with Socrates about virtue in the dialogue that bears his name, described the experience differently. He compared Socrates to a torpedo fish, the flat, wide creature that lives on the sea floor and numbs whatever it touches. He was not being unkind, exactly, or not only unkind. He was describing with some precision what it felt like to enter a conversation confident of one's ground and leave it unable to feel the floor. He had arrived knowing what virtue was. He had 3 definitions ready, one after another, and watched each one come apart in the same way as the others, not through Socrates' superior alternative, but through the simple extension of Meno's own ideas into territory they could not coherently occupy. The problem was not that Socrates had a better answer. The problem was that Meno's answers, under pressure, had revealed themselves not to be answers at all. Thrasymachus enters the Republic differently from Euthyphro or Meno. He does not wait to be examined. He arrives already angry, already contemptuous of the conversation Socrates is having with Polemarchus about justice, already prepared for the particular frustration of watching Socrates perform ignorance in front of people who have not yet noticed. It is a performance. He calls the performance out immediately. He says he is tired of the evasion, tired of the questions without answers, and that he will say what justice actually is if Socrates will stop hiding behind the pretense of not knowing. He says justice is the advantage of the stronger, that power is the only thing that has ever made the rules, and that calling these rules justice is simply the way the powerful legitimize what they intend to do anyway. His argument has force and has not collapsed easily, and the early books of the Republic take it seriously, even as they work against it. What matters here is the fury with which he enters, the barely concealed contempt for the entire procedure of asking questions in public as though any good could come of it. Because Thrasymachus has seen what happens when people ask questions in the agora. He has watched men of standing made to look foolish. He has watched certainties dissolve into confusion, and watched the confused men blame themselves, or the conversation, or the city, rather than ever sitting with the confusion long enough to see what it might open into. He finds it a waste, and possibly a danger. He is not entirely wrong, which is part of what makes him worth taking seriously. The symposium gives Alcibiades the floor late in the evening, when the wine has been passed enough times that the speakers are saying what they might otherwise have managed not to say. Alcibiades arrives in a garland he has mistakenly put on Socrates' head, and he is flushed and unsteady, and when he speaks about Socrates, he speaks with the particular honesty of someone who has given up managing the impression he makes. He describes what it is like to be in Socrates' company. He says that Socrates is the only person who has ever made him feel ashamed. Not the shame that comes from public humiliation or from being caught in a visible wrong, but the shame that comes from holding a mirror in front of a life one has chosen, and seeing, clearly and without escape, that it falls short of what one knows is possible. He says he has tried to avoid Socrates for exactly this reason. He has noticed that proximity to Socrates produces in him a feeling he cannot sustain and cannot easily dismiss, a sense that his own life, successful by nearly every measure the city offers, is somehow not the life he should be living, and he cannot argue with the feeling. It does not come from Socrates making accusations or pronouncing judgments. It comes from the questions. The questions find the gaps between what Alcibiades believes he values and what his actual choices demonstrate that he values, and they sit in those gaps without mercy, not because Socrates intends cruelty, but because the questions are simply honest, and honesty, applied carefully to a life, does not always spare the person whose life it is examining. What Alcibiades describes, and cannot entirely name, is the experience of encountering the possibility of genuine self-knowledge and discovering that it is not a comfort. The inscription at Delphi had seemed perhaps like an invitation to something clarifying, something that might produce a more coherent sense of who one is. What Socratic examination actually produced, in person after person, was a kind of accounting that most people were not prepared to welcome. Not because the accounting was cruel, because it was accurate, and accuracy about one's own life, when it arrives uninvited in the middle of an afternoon, is one of the harder things the world offers. Socrates maintained that this accuracy was not optional. This is the part of his position that the people around him found most difficult to absorb. Not the specific questions, not the particular examinations, but the claim underlying all of them, that a life conducted without this kind of scrutiny is not simply less philosophical, but somehow less fully a life. He was not saying this to be difficult. The argument in the apology is careful and sincere. He was saying that there is a difference between living and living knowingly, between moving through the days, accumulating opinions, and actually examining the grounds on which those opinions rest, and that this difference matters enough that he would face death rather than abandon the practice that maintained it. He walked through Athens in full knowledge that his presence was not welcomed by everyone who encountered it. The craftsmen of the city, the cobblers and builders and potters and smiths, were on the whole genuinely skilled at what they made. Their hands knew things that Socrates' questions could not reach, and he acknowledged this readily. But he found, when he spoke with them, that the genuine expertise of their hands had migrated, in their own minds, into a general confidence about everything, about justice, about piety, about the good life, about what the city required, and what the gods demanded. The confidence was invisible to them. It felt like knowledge from the inside. What the examination revealed was that it was something closer to the weight of assumption, accumulated, unreflected, comfortable, until the moment someone set a question against it. He did not enjoy this, or not in the way the charge of intellectual vanity would suggest. What he found in nearly every conversation was the same thing. A person who had arrived at certainty by a route they had never traced and could not now retrace, and who experienced the inability to retrace it, not as a flaw in the certainty, but as an irrelevant demand. Why should a man who makes excellent pots explain the epistemological foundations of his moral confidence? The question seemed insulting from inside the confidence. From outside it, the question seemed like the only honest one. There is a passage in the Apology, not often quoted, in which Socrates describes the specific texture of his mission as something given to him by the god and impossible to lay down. He uses an image. He is a gadfly, and Athens is a large, well-bred horse, inclined by nature towards sleep. The gadfly stings not to cause pain, but to cause wakefulness, to keep the horse from the comfortable torpor that would otherwise overtake it. It is not a flattering image for either party. The gadfly is small and easily killed, and the horse is powerful and will eventually manage to rid itself of the irritation. But the horse, once the gadfly is gone, will simply go back to sleep. This is not a prophecy Socrates delivers with any particular sorrow. It is an observation about what tends to happen when communities lose the particular kind of discomfort that makes them examine themselves. The posture he maintained through all of this, the steady, unhurried return to the question, the apparent calm in the face of other people's frustration, was not, in the accounts of those who knew him well, the absence of feeling. Alcibiades makes clear that Socrates was not cold. He was capable of attention, of genuine warmth, of the specific quality of full presence that makes a person feel that they are, for the duration of the conversation, the only thing in the room that matters. What he had managed, or what the practice of examination had produced in him over decades, was something closer to the inability to be deflected by the discomfort of being honest. He could hold a difficult question steadily. He could stay in the examination when the person on the other side of it was angry, or humiliated, or simply exhausted by the effort of not knowing. He stayed because he had, over a long life of this practice, found that the difficulty of honesty was more livable than the case with which one could avoid it. Socratic irony, as his companions understood it, was not a weapon of condescension. It was a kind of hospitality, unusual, demanding, sometimes deeply uncomfortable, but extending to every person who wandered into conversation with him, the specific gift of being taken seriously enough to be questioned. He did not examine people because he believed them foolish. He examined them because he believed that every person who thought carefully enough about their own beliefs would, eventually, find the same thing he had found, that the gap between what one claims to know and what one can demonstrate knowing is wide, and that the most honest response to this gap is not to paper over it with more confident assertions, but to remain in the gap and see what can actually be built there. The problem, and he was under no illusions about this, was that remaining in the gap is uncomfortable in ways that most people find easier to exit than to endure. Euthyphro exited. Mendo expressed admiration for the torpor the conversation had produced, and then returned to his lodgings. And Thrasymachus declared the whole enterprise a waste, and made the strongest argument he had for a position that required no examination at all. Alcibiades described, in the Symposium, the precise sensation of encountering the possibility of change and declining it. None of these responses was unusual. None of them should have surprised Socrates, and the evidence suggests that they did not. What is interesting, and what the dialogues return to without fully resolving, is the question of what the examination was supposed to produce, given that its immediate effects were so often flight, or anger, or the temporary discomfort of aporia without the sustained engagement that might have followed it. If the goal was to lead people into genuine knowledge, the dialogues offer almost no evidence of success in those terms. The conversations end without definitions, the interlocutors depart before anything is settled, the questions remain, by every account, unanswered. But Socrates, speaking in the Apology about his own life, does not describe failure. He describes a service, imperfect, ongoing, sometimes resisted, sometimes resented, but a service nonetheless. The examination of beliefs is not a path to certain knowledge. It is a path to honest uncertainty, which is not nothing. It is, in fact, the thing. Conscious ignorance, held clearly, without flinching, as a genuine description of one's actual epistemic position, is not the same as mere ignorance. It knows what it lacks. It does not mistake the absence of knowledge for the presence of it. And this, Socrates argued, is not a small difference. He was not young when these arguments were fully formed. He had arrived at them through decades of exactly the kind of examination he recommended, walking through the city, sitting with people, asking questions, and following them wherever they went without deciding in advance where they should arrive. The stonemason's son had learned something about patience with hard material. Not that hard material eventually becomes soft, not that patience is rewarded with ease, but that the material has its own structure, its own logic, and that the work of understanding it requires sitting with its resistance long enough to learn what it can and cannot give. The people who loved him, and there were people who loved him, genuinely and with the particular devotion that forms around someone who has changed the way you see your own life, found in him something that was difficult to name, but easy to recognize in retrospect. He made thinking feel like the most natural thing in the world, rather than an effort or a performance or a specialization available only to those with the right training. He did this by doing it in the open, in the middle of ordinary commerce and noise, in conversations that anyone could join or leave, about questions that anyone could recognize as real. What is courage, and does a person who has it know that they do? What is justice, and can a city be just if the people in it are not? What is piety, and if the gods are the source of it, what happens to it in their absence? These questions are still here. They have not been stored away in the places where old questions go when they have been answered. They are in the same condition they were in when Socrates carried them through the agora, unresolved, genuinely open, requiring of anyone who takes them seriously a willingness to hold the uncertainty without reaching prematurely for the comfort of a closing answer. He walked, after every encounter, through the same streets. He passed the same stalls. He nodded to the same faces. He was not performing equanimity. He had, through long practice, arrived at something that looked from the outside like composure, but was from the inside more like the absence of a particular kind of fear, the fear that honesty about one's ignorance is a diminishment rather than an achievement. He had examined this fear in himself as he examined everything else and found it unreasonable. Not all fears are unreasonable. He had given this one enough of his attention to know that this one was. What the inscription at Delphi asked, taken seriously, was not a single act of self-examination, but a lifetime of it. Not a look in the mirror followed by a conclusion, but a sustained practice of remaining accountable to what one actually knows, as opposed to what one has been comfortable assuming. Socrates appears to have taken this instruction at something like its literal scope. He spent his life not arriving at a self that he then knew, but continuing to examine whatever self presented itself, finding it each time somewhat different from what he had expected, and continuing anyway. The examined life was not, in his account, an easier life. It was not more comfortable, more socially successful, more peaceful in the ordinary sense. It was frequently uncomfortable. It had generated a quantity of animosity that eventually became a legal charge. It had not made him wealthy or powerful or secure. What it had given him, or what he believed it had given him, was something harder to name and considerably more durable, a life that he could account for, whose choices he could trace back to reasons he had actually examined, whose beliefs he held, not because they were inherited or convenient or confirmed by the people around him, but because they had survived the kind of questioning that he applied to everything else. He continued to walk through Athens after every difficult encounter, after Euthyphro's departure, after Menno's comparison to the torpedo fish, after Thrasymachus's barely managed contempt, after Alcibiades' confession and return to the habits he had confessed to wishing he could change. Socrates walked on, not unaffected. The accounts are too specific, too human for that reading, but genuinely undeflected. The examination did not depend on its results. It did not require gratitude or recognition, or the satisfaction of interlocutors who left the conversation transformed rather than merely unsettled. It required only the honest continuation of itself, one question at a time, through the ordinary afternoon of a city that would, for a few more years, continue to let him walk through it, asking. The agora held everyone, in the end, the sellers and the buyers, and the litigants and the politicians and the visitors from elsewhere who had heard there was a strange old man here who would question you about what you believed and not stop until you were no longer sure. Some of them came looking for him. Some of them found him by accident and left changed in ways they spent years afterward trying to understand. Some of them left angry and stayed angry, and their anger was in its own way evidence of how close the questioning had come to something they would rather not have examined. Socrates seems to have found all of these responses comprehensible. He had expected them. He had been prepared by a lifetime of the practice for the resistance that genuine examination tends to produce in those who have not already chosen it for themselves. He was not a comfortable figure. He was not intended to be. The gadfly image makes this plain enough, and it is his own image, chosen deliberately. But what the historical and philosophical record also shows, through the testimony of those who knew him best, is that he was also something else alongside the discomfort, something that the people who loved him found difficult to leave and impossible to quite forget. There was in him, alongside the questions and the method and the sustained refusal to let comfortable assumptions pass unchallenged, something that his companions recognized as care. He asked the questions he asked, not because he found ignorance amusing or interlocutors easy targets, but because he believed that the people he was talking to were capable of better clarity, better honesty, better accounts of their own lives and beliefs, and that the questions were the only way he knew of opening a path toward that. He went on walking after every conversation ended. The city noise closed back around him. He passed back into the ordinary flow of the afternoon, indistinguishable from a distance from any other old man moving through the market. The questions went with him, not resolved, not finished, not arrived at any terminus that he could identify as rest. They continued, as they had always continued, because they were not the kind of questions that resolve. They were the kind that open further the longer one stays with them, revealing not answers, but the shape of the territory they are mapping, wide, honest, and not yet fully known. The noise in the courtroom had been settling for some time before it finally went still. 501 Athenian citizens had gathered in the open air of the Heliaea on a morning in 399 BCE, assembling the way Athenians assembled for everything that mattered, with argument and scraping benches, and the particular restlessness of a democratic body that believed in its own authority and wanted to demonstrate that belief through the act of using it. Then the charges were read aloud, and the noise became quiet, and somewhere in that quiet, a man of 70 years stood and listened as though the words being read were not about him, or rather as though they were about him, in the way that weather is about the landscape it passes over, present, consequential, but not the landscape's primary concern. The charges were two: a Sabaea, impiety toward the gods of Athens, the sacred civic gods, whose worship held the city together, and whose honor the city was bound to protect, and corruption of the youth, the allegation that Socrates had been turning young men away from the values, beliefs, and authorities their city had given them, and toward something else, something vaguer and more troubling, a habit of questioning that served no useful purpose and left the young men worse equipped for their civic lives than they had been before they encountered him. The men who brought the charges were Miletus, a young poet, Anytus, a wealthy and influential democratic politician, and Lycon, a rhetorician. They stood at the front of that large open space and made their case in front of everyone assembled there, and then they sat down, and Socrates stood up. He had no written speech. He had no prepared argument. What he had was everything he had always had in the agora: the capacity to think carefully in the presence of others, the willingness to say what seemed to him true, regardless of whether it was welcome, and a voice that witnesses consistently described as neither loud nor soft, but simply even, with the quality of something that did not need to work to be heard. What Athens was doing on that morning was not precisely what it appeared to be doing. On its surface, it was a legal proceeding, a city exercising its democratic right to charge, try, and judge one of its citizens according to established law, and it was that. But underneath the surface of the proceeding, the city was doing something more complicated, something that cannot be understood without the years that preceded it. Athens had lost the Peloponnesian War to Sparta in 404 BCE, 5 years before the trial. The defeat had been catastrophic, not only military, but constitutional, bringing with it the brief and brutal rule of the 30 tyrants, an oligarchic body that had governed through fear and violence, and had been supported, or at least associated with, several people connected to Socrates. Critias, who had led the 30 and committed atrocities during that period, had spent time with Socrates in earlier years. Alcibiades, the brilliant and self-serving general whose decisions had contributed to Athenian disaster in Sicily, had been closely associated with him. The democracy that had been restored after the oligarchy had enacted a formal amnesty. No one was to be prosecuted for actions taken during the period of the 30, and so the charges against Socrates could not be explicitly political. But the city's grievances were political, threaded through with military humiliation and constitutional trauma, and those grievances needed somewhere to go. The charge of impiety gave them somewhere to go. Eusebia was serious in Athens, not merely as a religious matter, but as a civic one. The gods of the city were the city's gods. Their worship was part of the social fabric, part of what bound Athenians to one another and to their shared history. A man who questioned the gods, or who introduced new divine figures, or whose habit of questioning corroded the reverence that the civic religion required. Such a man was not simply unorthodox, but structurally disruptive, a loosening of the threads that held the community together. The charge had been used before. It had weight. And whatever the personal beliefs of Anytus and Meletus, the charge worked because it located in legal language something that was genuinely felt. This man and his questions were making Athens uncomfortable in a way that Athens had decided it no longer wished to tolerate. Socrates had been making Athens uncomfortable for decades. The Agora conversations, the examinations of generals and politicians and craftsmen and poets, the steady, patient demonstration that the people most relied upon to know what justice was, or what courage was, or what piety was, could not in fact say what those things were when asked carefully. All of this had been accumulating for 30 years. The discomfort was not incidental to what he did. It was, in a precise sense, the point. A man who believed that the unexamined life was not worth living, who believed that the most dangerous ignorance was the ignorance of those who believed themselves to know, would necessarily disturb a community that had organized itself around the shared confidence of its leading citizens. He had been examining those leading citizens in public, in front of each other and in front of crowds, and finding them unable to account for what they were most confident about. Decades of that will accumulate into something. The apology, its name from the Greek apologia, a formal speech of defense, records what Socrates said in his own behalf, and it is one of the stranger documents in the history of human thought, because what it records is not a defense in the usual sense. A man defending himself against a capital charge before a jury that holds his life in its hands would ordinarily be expected to speak carefully, to appeal to the jury's sympathy, to make himself appear as non-threatening and as ordinary as possible, to remind the jury of his family and his years of service, and the many ways in which he has been a good and faithful citizen of the city that is now judging him. Socrates does approximately none of this. He recounts the story of the oracle at Delphi, who reportedly told Chaerephon that no one was wiser than Socrates, which led Socrates to examine the city's reputed wise men and discover that none of them knew what they claimed to know, and that his own wisdom consisted in knowing that he did not know. He describes this activity not as something he might have done differently, but as a divine mission he cannot abandon. He tells the jury that if they offered him acquittal on the condition that he stop philosophizing, he would refuse. That to abandon philosophy to preserve his life would be exactly the inversion of values he has spent his life arguing against. The preference for the body over the soul, the preference for mere survival over the only kind of life worth living. The moment of that imagined offer, the jury acquitting him on condition of his silence, is one of the most precise in the apology. Socrates does not soften it or suggest that perhaps there might be some compromise possible. He states directly, and with the appearance of complete calm, that the god has assigned him to this work, and that he will practice philosophy for as long as he lives, and that disobeying the god in order to obey a human verdict would be impious in a way that would genuinely deserve the name, a deeper impiety than anything he has actually been charged with. The implicit argument is deliberate. He is not simply expressing personal stubbornness. He is stating a philosophical position about the relative authority of inner knowledge and outer command, that a man who understands what is genuinely good cannot abandon what he understands simply because the community has decided he should, because the community's decision does not alter the truth of what he has understood. The jury's authority over his body is real, and he acknowledges it. Its authority over his philosophical life is another matter entirely. There is something worth attending to in how strange that position sounds, and also in how internally consistent it is. Every argument Socrates had been making in the Agora for 30 years had been directed toward the same point, that what most people call knowledge is opinion, that opinion is not a reliable guide to how to live, that genuine knowledge of the good is both possible and urgently necessary, and that the path to it runs through the exact kind of examination that the city is now trying to shut down. If any of that is true, then stopping examination because a jury has voted that it should stop is precisely the wrong response. It would mean privileging the democracy's doxa, its collective opinion, over the episteme, the genuine, accountable knowledge that philosophy exists to pursue. The trial, on this account, is not a place where the philosophical arguments pause while legal proceedings happen. The trial is the philosophical argument continuing by other means, with different stakes, and Socrates is conducting it in exactly the way he has always conducted it. He was convicted by a vote of approximately 280 to 220. That is, of the 501 citizens assembled to judge him, more than 220 were prepared to let him go. The margin is not as wide as it might have been, and there is something almost vertiginous about the arithmetic. More than a third of the city in that room, on that morning, listening to a 70-year-old man explain why he would not stop asking questions, even to save his own life, and choosing to acquit him. The closeness of the vote does not change the outcome. It does suggest something about how the city was divided, how uncertain the assembled citizens were about what they were being asked to do, how many of them were troubled by the charge, even as they were prepared to uphold it. After the verdict of guilt, Athenian legal procedure required both the prosecution and the defense to propose penalties, and the jury would then choose between them. The prosecution proposed death. Socrates was expected to propose an alternative, exile, perhaps, or a fine, something the jury could accept in place of execution, something that would allow the proceedings to conclude without requiring the city to put one of its own citizens to death. What Socrates proposed instead has been retained across 24 centuries because of how perfectly it captures what he was. He suggested, apparently with sincerity, that the appropriate reward for his services to Athens was free meals at public expense in the Prytaneum, the building where Athens housed and fed its Olympic victors and other great benefactors of the city. He was, he reasoned, one of the greatest benefactors the city had ever had. He had spent his life trying to help his fellow citizens become better people, more honest in their thinking, more aware of what they did not know. He had done this without pay, in poverty, entirely in service of the city's genuine good. What would be more fitting than to recognize that service in the way Athens recognized its most distinguished citizens? The sincerity of the proposal is genuinely difficult to read, and perhaps that difficulty is part of its meaning, that Socrates, at the moment when performance might have saved him, simply continued to be exactly what he had always been. When the jury chose death, he received the verdict, and then turned to face those who had voted to convict him. What he said to them has the quality of something that will not leave a listener easily, not because it is angry, it is not angry, but because it is so completely itself. He told them that they had made an error, and that the error would cost them more than it cost him. He told them that they had killed him, not because he was genuinely harmful to Athens, but because they found his examinations unpleasant, and that in avoiding the small difficulty of being questioned, they had chosen the much larger difficulty of having done something unjust. His death was a harm to his body, which was temporary, and which he had never particularly valued. The injustice they had committed was a harm to their souls, and on the account he had always held, the soul was what mattered. Its care, its cultivation, its orientation toward genuine knowledge of the good. They had not silenced the inquiry, they had damaged themselves. And then, with a composure that appears in every account, and that unsettled everyone who witnessed it, he told them something about what would happen next. He predicted that killing him would not bring them the relief they were looking for. Other questioners would come, many of them, younger ones with the energy of outrage on their side, less patient and more aggressive. The city had tried to solve its discomfort by removing the man who caused it, but the discomfort was not caused by one man. It was caused by the questions, by the particular difficulty that follows from taking seriously the possibility that the things a city believes most confidently may be the things it understands least clearly. Those questions had not originated with Socrates and would not end with him. All the city had done was make them louder. The days between the verdict and the execution stretched longer than expected because of a sacred Athenian custom. While a state ship was on a religious voyage to Delos, executions were suspended. The ship had departed just before the trial and would not return for weeks. And so Socrates waited in prison, in chains, receiving his friends each morning as they were admitted by the guard, continuing to do in the prison cell the thing that the city had just condemned him to death for doing, thinking, arguing, questioning, following the argument wherever it led. His friends were not calm. His friends wept, proposed escape, urged him to take the opportunity they had arranged, argued that the verdict was unjust, and that an unjust verdict created no binding obligation. Crito, one of his oldest friends, came before dawn on one of those mornings with a plan and a genuine plea. The means were ready, the guards had been managed, Socrates had only to consent to go. Socrates heard all of it and asked whether it was just for him to escape, not whether it was possible, not whether the verdict was fair, whether, given everything he had argued about the nature of obligation and the relationship between the individual and the laws of the city, his leaving would be consistent with what he had always held. The question, as always, was the tool he reached for first. The argument Socrates makes in Plato's Crito is one that has troubled readers ever since, not because it is obscure, but because it is genuinely difficult. He imagines the laws of Athens themselves coming to speak with him, and he has them ask him this: has he not lived his entire life under these laws, been educated by them, raised his children under them, benefited from everything the civic order provided? Has he not, by remaining in Athens when he could have left, entered into something very like a binding agreement with the city that governs him? And if so, does the city's having made an unjust decision in this particular case release him from the whole of that agreement? The laws say no. The laws say that a single unjust verdict, however painful, does not dissolve the entire structure of civic obligation any more than a single unjust decision by a parent dissolves the whole of what children owe to those who raised them. The argument is not comfortable, and it is not meant to be, but it is consistent, consistent with everything Socrates had argued about the examined life and the necessity of holding one's most important beliefs under scrutiny, including the belief that one's own survival might justify whatever action preserves it. Socrates stays. He sends Crito away. He returns to the philosophical conversation he was having before Crito arrived, picking it up at the point where it had been interrupted, the way a man picks up a stone he has set down temporarily and carries it wherever he was going. What the trial of Socrates poses to anyone who sits with it for long enough is a question that the verdict did not answer and the execution did not close. The question is about authority, about where the final claim on a person's actions resides, and whether the answer is the same when the individual is wise and the community is confused, as when the individual is confused and the community is wise. Socrates believed, with considerable consistency across every dialogue in which the question arises, that the care of the soul, the cultivation of genuine knowledge, the ongoing examination of what one believes and why, carries a deeper obligation than any civic or social authority, not because civic life is unimportant, but because a civic life built on doxa, on collectively held opinion, mistaken for genuine knowledge, is already moving toward the kind of failure that Athens had recently and catastrophically demonstrated. The city had defeated Persia. The city had built the Parthenon. The city had invented a form of self-governance that would be argued over for the next 2.5 millennia. And then the city had, through a chain of decisions made confidently by people who did not understand what they were deciding, lost a long war, invited tyranny, and turned its democratic process toward the execution of the man who had spent 30 years trying to show it exactly how this kind of thing happened. He was not bitter about it. This is the detail that keeps returning, not because bitterness would have been inappropriate, but because its absence is genuinely philosophically significant. Bitterness requires the belief that things should have gone differently, that the outcome was a departure from what the situation actually called for. Socrates did not appear to believe that. He appeared to believe that the situation had called for what he had done, the questioning, the examination, the refusal to stop, and that the city had called for what it had done, because a city that has organized its confidence around unexamined opinions will eventually find a persistent examiner of those opinions intolerable. Neither outcome surprised him. He had been watching both for a long time. The question of what a community owes to the person inside it who questions it most seriously is not a question that Athens answered and sent into history. It is a question that recurs in every community that has ever had to decide between the comfort of shared certainty and the difficulty of genuine inquiry. The comfort is not nothing. Shared certainty does real work. It allows people to act together, to coordinate, to build and sustain the structures of a common life without having to adjudicate every foundational question before proceeding. The difficulty of genuine inquiry is also not nothing. It is what keeps those structures honest, what prevents the shared certainties from calcifying into the kind of confident wrongness that Socrates found everywhere he looked. The tension between them is not resolvable at the theoretical level. Every community that has ever existed has had to find in practice its own position on it, and very few have found a position they have not later had reason to reconsider. Athens had found its position on that particular morning with a vote of 280 to 220. What is striking in the long aftermath of that vote is that Athens appears to have known almost immediately that it had made an error, not the legal error of misapplying a statute, but something deeper, a failure of the kind that Socrates himself would have described as a failure of soul. Within a generation, the trial was being discussed as a cautionary example. The city that had produced the most searching philosophical tradition in the ancient world had, at a moment of fear and political exhaustion, voted to silence the man most characteristic of that tradition. The philosopher Xenophon, who had known Socrates personally, wrote accounts of his conversations that portrayed him as wise, just, and entirely beneficial to everyone who genuinely engaged with him. Plato, who had been present at the trial, spent the rest of his life writing dialogues in which Socrates continued to ask the questions Athens had tried to stop. The questions did not stop. They could not be stopped by a vote. They had taken up residence in the minds of everyone who had ever genuinely encountered them, and minds are not subject to the jurisdiction of the Heliaea. There is something in the persistence of those questions, their continued motion through the centuries, their ability to arrive in new minds and begin their work again as though no time has passed, that carries its own kind of answer to what the trial had raised. Not an answer to whether Socrates was legally guilty, which remains a matter of genuine historical and philosophical complexity. Not an answer to whether the democratic process that convicted him was legitimate, which it was, in the formal sense that it followed the procedures the city had established for exactly this kind of decision, but an answer to the deeper question of whether what he was doing could be stopped, or whether the inquiry he had given his life to had already passed beyond the reach of any verdict a jury could deliver. The quiet observation he made to his accusers after the verdict, that in attempting to silence him, they had ensured the continuation of everything they were trying to silence, proved to be one of the most precisely accurate predictions he ever made. Not because he intended it as a prophecy. He was, as always, simply following the argument where it led. The argument led here that ideas capable of surviving examination do not require a particular person to carry them forward. They carry themselves. They move through anyone who encounters them honestly, and then through whoever encounters those people. And the chain does not require the founder to remain alive in order to continue extending itself. After the verdict, after the exchange about penalties, after the final words to those who had voted against him, Socrates was led back to the prison that had held him throughout the trial period, and his friends were permitted to accompany him for part of the way, and then the doors closed, and the afternoon light fell across the Athenian streets in the ordinary way that afternoon light falls, across streets when something that seems as though it ought to have changed. Everything has been absorbed back into the texture of ordinary time. The city went on doing what cities do. The agora continued its commerce. The colonnades held their usual inhabitants. The conversations that had been interrupted by the spectacle of the trial resumed, and new conversations began, and some of them were probably about Socrates, and some of those were probably the beginning of exactly what he had predicted, the slower, more various, more persistent continuation of the inquiry by the people who had known him, and the people who knew those people, and the people who would, in later generations, encounter his words in written form, and find themselves stopped, mid-stride, by a question they had not anticipated and could not easily put down. The trial produced its verdict. The verdict produced its execution. The execution produced something no one in that courtroom had sufficient imagination to foresee, a man so thoroughly himself in the act of dying that the dying became another demonstration of everything the living had tried to show. The question of what a community owes to the voice asking it to examine itself did not receive an answer on that morning in 399 BCE. It received instead a demonstration of what happens when the question is avoided, when the community decides that the questioner is the problem, that removing him will remove the difficulty he embodies, that a vote can do what only honest inquiry can do. The question remained. It had always been going to remain. It was the kind of question that could not be resolved by a verdict any more than the question of what justice is could be resolved by a judge's ruling, and Socrates had always known that, and the city had suspected it, and the suspicion had contributed to the fury behind the charges, and the fury had produced a margin of conviction too narrow to feel confident, but wide enough to be legally definitive. 280 to 220, on a morning that was probably, like most Athenian mornings, warm and clear and full of the sounds of a city going about its purposes, without particular awareness that one of those purposes on that particular morning was becoming permanent. The question that Athens asked and failed to answer, whether the community can survive the questioner it most needs and most fears, did not disperse into the Athenian air when the jury filed out and the afternoon came on. It stayed. It has been staying ever since, in every assembly, every institution, every common body that has ever had to decide whether the voice making it uncomfortable was the voice of a troublemaker to be managed or a conscience to be heard. The answer, if there is one, has not yet arrived, but the question, undamaged and unhurried, continues exactly as Socrates would have expected it to, moving through careful minds toward whatever it has always been moving toward. On the morning of his death, before anyone had arrived, Socrates sat on the edge of the low prison bed and rubbed his ankles where the shackles had been. The iron was gone. The skin beneath was tender, slightly warm, the way skin is when something that has pressed against it for a long time is finally lifted away. He sat with this small relief for a moment, not mournfully, not dramatically, simply noticing it, the way a person notices anything that has changed in a familiar room. The cell was not dark. Light came in at an angle, the particular pale light of an Athenian morning in spring, and it fell across the stone floor in a shape that shifted as the sun climbed. He would have known this light. He had been in this room for 30 days, since the sacred ship left for Delos, and the executions were suspended in its honor, and in 30 days, a person learns the arc of a room's light, the way they learn anything patient and repeating. He sat quietly. His friends had not yet arrived. Whatever he was thinking in those last private minutes before the day became a shared thing is not recorded anywhere, and the silence around it is its own kind of knowledge. Phaedo, who was there that day and who would give his name to the dialogue Plato built from the memory of it, recalled that when they arrived, Socrates seemed already settled into something, not resignation, not performance, something closer to the mood of a man who has finished a long piece of work and is regarding it with the calm attention of completion. He had bathed himself carefully that morning, an ordinary act of household consideration, the kind of thing done so the women would not have the additional labor of washing a corpse. In a single gesture, the philosopher and the man were the same person, attending to the practical and the final without distinguishing between them. His friends wept at the edges of the room. Some turned away. Apollodorus, who was known for his intensity of feeling, could not contain himself and wept more openly than the others, and Socrates noticed this and commented on it with something like gentle puzzlement. He had sent the women away earlier precisely so that this kind of scene might be avoided, and here it was arriving anyway, through the men. He was not dismissive of their grief. He seemed to find it genuinely interesting, the way he found most human responses genuinely interesting, as evidence of what a person believed. If they believed death was a great harm, then weeping made complete sense. The question, to him, was whether that belief could survive examination. This was the thing about Socrates that no one who knew him seemed able to adequately describe to people who had not. He did not change in the face of his own death. He was the same person in the cell that he had been in the agora, in the gymnasium, at the symposium, on the battlefield 30 years before. The quality of his attention did not shift. The questions he was asking were the same questions he had always asked. Only the setting had changed, and to a mind like his, the setting had never been the point. He returned, in those final hours, to the question that had been circling beneath all the others for most of his life. Not what is justice, or what is courage, or what is the good, but something quieter and more fundamental, what happens when the body stops, and whether anything that could be called the self continues after it. His friends had been hoping, perhaps, for comfort of the ordinary kind. What they received was something else, an argument, carefully made, unhurried, with regular pauses to ask whether anyone had an objection he had not yet considered. Plato records 4 such arguments in the dialogue, and what is notable about them is not their conclusions, but their method. Socrates did not ask for belief. He asked for attention. He walked through each line of reasoning the way he had always walked through the agora, at his ordinary pace, pausing when something required closer examination, doubling back when a path turned out to lead somewhere unexpected. His friends were invited to follow and also to resist, and the resistance was treated not as an obstacle, but as a contribution. The first argument began with the observation that opposites generate each other. Sleep comes from waking, and waking from sleep. What is larger was once smaller, and what is smaller may become larger again. If death comes from life, then life may come from death, not the particular life of the particular person, but the movement between states, the underlying motion that makes the alternation possible. It was the kind of argument that feels immediately reasonable, and then held a little longer, opens into something larger than its initial shape suggested. The way a door frame, looked at steadily, begins to reveal the room it holds. The second argument reached back to something Socrates had been thinking about for a long time, the strangeness of learning. When the slave boy in Thessaly had been guided through the geometry lesson by questions alone, arriving at a truth he had apparently never been taught, Socrates had found this genuinely puzzling. Where had the knowledge come from? If the boy had never been taught it, but could arrive at it from within himself, then perhaps the arrival was not a new acquisition, but a recovery. The soul, before it entered the body, might have known these things, might have been in direct contact with the unchanging forms that mathematics describes, and what appears to be learning might be, more precisely, remembering. This was the theory of recollection, anamnesis, and in the prison cell, Socrates returned to it, not as a curiosity, but as an argument for the soul's existence before birth, which would, if it held, make its existence after death at least thinkable. His friends Simmias and Cebes pushed back. They were not hostile, they were careful, which was the better thing to be. Simmias offered the image of a lyre, suggesting that the soul might be to the body, as a harmony is to an instrument, real, audible, consequential, but entirely dependent on the physical structure that produces it. When the instrument is broken, the harmony does not go anywhere, it simply ceases. Socrates took this objection seriously, as he took every genuine objection seriously, and then began, quietly and without urgency, to work through why the harmony image, however appealing, did not quite do what Simmias thought it did. A harmony cannot exist before the instrument. The theory of recollection requires the soul to have existed before the body. The analogy, pressed carefully, breaks along that line. Cebes's objection was harder. Even if the soul outlasts individual bodies, it might wear through eventually, like a coat worn through many winters, until finally it gives way. Socrates met this with the fourth and final argument, the one he considered the most careful, the argument from the nature of the forms. The soul, unlike the body, is not composite. It does not have parts that can separate or dissolve. It belongs, by its nature, to the order of what is unchanging, rather than the order of what changes, to what is eternal, rather than what perishes. And life itself, whatever it is something the soul brings wherever it goes, not a quality the soul happens to possess in the way a body happens to be warm, but something inseparable from what the soul is. What carries life cannot receive its opposite. What cannot receive death cannot die. His friends received this in silence for a moment, not the silence of defeat, and not quite the silence of conviction, the silence of people who have been thinking very hard and have arrived, at least, at a place where they cannot immediately see the flaw. Socrates seemed satisfied with this. He had not asked them to believe. He had asked them to think carefully. Whether the arguments would finally hold was, he acknowledged, something no one in the room could claim to know with certainty. But the effort of making them, the honest engagement with the question, rather than the flinching away from it, seemed to him the right way to spend the remaining hours of an examined life. There is a particular view of death that Socrates had been developing across many years, a view not of what death is, since this genuinely cannot be known, but of what it would mean to fear it. To fear death is to behave as though death is certainly a great harm, but certainty on this point is not available. Death might be an endless, dreamless sleep, and in that case the fear is unwarranted. Nothing in human experience, Socrates suggested, is as peaceable as a truly untroubled night. Or death might be a migration, the soul passing to another place, and in that case the philosopher would find, on the other side, an opportunity to continue the only activity that had ever fully satisfied him, asking questions, in the company of those who could not be put to death for it. He said this last part with something that the dialogue records as dry good humor, the prospect of cross-examining Agamemnon and Odysseus, of meeting Hesiod and Homer and asking them what they actually meant, was one he appeared to find genuinely appealing. He did not dwell on it, but its presence in the argument is worth sitting with. The lightness of it, the suggestion that a life conducted through questions might find even its ending a beginning of something it was already acquainted with. The afternoon light in the cell began to change. The attendant who was responsible for administering the hemlock had been waiting at a careful distance all day, and when the sun was low enough, he came in. He was visibly distressed, which Socrates noticed and addressed with what the Phaedo records as genuine kindness. He told the man he had been good to him during the 30 days and asked him to approach. Then he asked a practical question, how much walking was needed, or whether the strength of the compound made walking unnecessary. His voice in this exchange was the same voice he had been using all day, the same voice he had used in the agora for 40 years. Whatever had changed in the room, the voice had not changed. He was told that walking only helped when the legs were still strong enough to require it. He was told to drink and then to walk about until he felt heaviness in his legs, and then to lie down. He took the cup. His friends were weeping again, fully now, not turned away. Socrates told them they had agreed to be brave, and reminded them that he had sent the women home for precisely this reason. Then, according to Phaedo, without trembling and without any apparent alteration in his color or expression, he raised the cup to his lips and drank it with considerable ease, as though the drinking of it were the most ordinary gesture in the world. He walked until the heaviness came. He lay down. The attendant, who had administered this procedure many times, pressed his foot and asked whether there was feeling. There was none. He pressed his leg. None. The coldness was moving upward. Socrates covered his face with his cloak. After a moment, he uncovered it and spoke what turned out to be his last words, a reminder to Crito that a cock was owed to Asclepius, the god of healing and recovery, and a request that the debt be paid, that it not be forgotten. Crito said it would be done, and asked whether there was anything else. Silence had already arrived. The cock owed to Asclepius is the last image, and it has occupied the minds of readers for 2,500 years, precisely because it does not explain itself. Asclepius was thanked for curing illness. To owe him a sacrifice on the day of one's death suggests, at least in one possible reading, that what looks like death might be understood from a certain angle as a cure, a recovery from something. The philosopher who had spent his life arguing that the soul is hindered by the body, that genuine knowledge requires the soul's orientation toward what is eternal rather than what perishes, that the philosopher's life is a preparation for exactly this transition, such a person might find, in that final moment, not loss but a kind of arrival. The debt to Asclepius was the last thought he chose to share with another person. It was not anxious, it was not afraid. It had the quality of someone who has arranged the room before leaving it. Phaedo describes the men in the cell afterwards as at a loss, not devastated in the way of sudden grief, but genuinely uncertain what to do with themselves, which is different. They had watched a person demonstrate, through the manner of his dying, everything he had argued about the manner of his living. The arguments had been made, the day had arrived, and the day had proceeded in a way that was, in its own terms, entirely consistent. What Hannah Arendt would observe, many centuries later, is that what made Socrates significant was not ultimately any conclusion he reached, but the activity itself. Thinking, the internal conversation a person conducts with themselves, the two-in-one dialogue that the genuinely reflective person cannot stop conducting, that makes it constitutionally impossible to do certain things without knowing clearly what one is doing and why. The person who thinks cannot perform the unreflective compliance that great harm requires, not because thinking produces virtuous conclusions, but because thinking is incompatible with the specific kind of blankness that lets a person participate in something terrible without really being there. Socrates' significance, in this view, lies not in the arguments he left behind, but in the example of a life in which thinking was not a tool or an instrument, but the primary activity, the thing itself, not a means towards something else. This is in one sense a humbling observation, and means that whatever Socrates discovered about piety or courage or justice or the good, and his dialogues arrive at no final conclusions on any of these questions. The lasting effect was not the discovery, but the practice. The questions he asked in the Agora did not resolve into answers. They resolved into more questions, more carefully formed, more honestly held. The men who encountered him and were undone by his questioning did not leave with new knowledge. They left with their old certainty removed and the genuine difficulty of the question visible for perhaps the first time. This is not nothing. Genuine unknowing, held honestly, is not the same as ignorance, and Socrates spent his life insisting on the difference with a patience that from a distance of centuries looks almost geological. The question of piety, the one he had been exploring with Euthyphro on the steps of the courthouse on a morning, now 30 years in the past, was never answered. Euthyphro walked away before it could be. But the question did not walk away with him. It moved through the air of the city and found its way into Plato's writing, and from there into the minds of everyone who has since sat with it, which is not a small number of people, and not a small span of years. What is piety? What is genuine reverence for what is genuinely sacred, as distinct from conventional observance, social expectation, the comfortable repetition of inherited practice? The question is still open. It has not been answered in any way that everyone finds satisfying. It may not be the kind of question that has that kind of answer. The question of courage, the one explored in the Laksuit with two generals who had spent their lives in battle and could not, under Socratic examination, produce a definition that held remains in the same condition. Every careful attempt to say what courage is eventually encounters a case that the definition cannot accommodate, an act that seems courageous but does not fit, or a fit that seems wrong. The definition comes apart. And yet the failure of definition is not the failure of the thing. Courage exists. People display it and recognize it and admire it. The question is what it is, and this turns out to be considerably harder than knowing it when one sees it. Socrates noted this distinction repeatedly, as though it were the most interesting thing about the human situation, that we navigate our lives largely on the basis of recognitions we cannot account for, judgments we cannot fully justify, values we could not define under examination if our lives depended on it, which in the case of Socrates' jury, effectively they did. The question of justice, the vast one, the one that opens the republic and does not close it, persists in every political arrangement that has ever tried to organize human beings fairly, and in every argument about whether any such arrangement has succeeded, what is owed, and to whom, and on what basis, whether fairness is a natural fact about the world or a human construction, whether the strong are simply doing what strength does when they take more than their share, as Thrasymachus argued, or whether justice is something real and discoverable, as Socrates spent his life assuming. The Republic explores this question for 9 books and arrives at a city no one would want to live in, and an account of the soul that remains, 2,500 years later, both beautiful and contested. The question is still open. Thrasymachus' objection has never been finally answered. Socrates' assumption has never been finally proven. They are still arguing in every court of law, every legislature, every household in which people try to determine what fairness requires. The question of knowledge, the one that generated the distinction between episteme and doxa, between genuine understanding and mere confident belief, is the one that perhaps more than any other bears most directly on ordinary life, because most of what most people believe they know is not episteme. It is doxa, it is belief, often true, often useful, but held without clear understanding of why it is true and what would have to be different for it to be false. The craftsmen of Athens knew their craft through episteme and their broader views through doxa, and could not themselves tell the difference. This is not a failing of the craftsman, it is the normal condition of knowing, which mostly proceeds without examining its own foundations, which mostly works well enough for practical purposes, and which occasionally, in the hands of people making large decisions about other people's lives, produces outcomes that examination might have forestalled. Socrates asked his questions in the agora, among the smell of bread and leather and animals, in the noise of a functioning city, and the questions have been traveling ever since. They passed through Plato's writing and through the academies that followed, through the commentaries and the councils and the monasteries and the lecture halls, and they arrived, unresolved, in every century they passed through. The people carrying them were different in each century, their languages different, their gods different, their political arrangements different, their hopes for what philosophy might finally deliver different, but the questions were recognizable across all of it, the same difficult shape, the same refusal to stay answered, the same willingness to wait in the silence that follows a serious attempt to address them. There is a kind of endurance in a question that cannot be answered. It is different from the endurance of an answered question, which sits in the solved state and waits for the next question to arrive. An unanswered question lives differently. It continues to require something of whoever holds it, not labor, not urgency, but a certain quality of continued openness, a willingness to sit with the difficulty without forcing a resolution that the difficulty cannot honestly sustain. Socrates demonstrated this quality for 70 years. His trial required it. His final morning, by all accounts, required very little of it, because the difficulty had long since become familiar, and the familiar difficulty had long since ceased to be distressing, and become something closer to a companion. The men who left the prison cell on that spring afternoon carried the questions with them, the way one carries something that was handed to one in a particular moment, and has become, over the years, so much a part of the weight of daily life that one no longer notices it as additional weight. Phaedo carried the memory of the afternoon and the arguments and the body growing still. Plato was not present. He was ill, or said he was ill, or some later tradition decided he was ill, but he received the account and spent the rest of his long life building a philosophy in part from the questions Socrates had left unanswered. Crito paid the debt to Asclepius, or so one assumes, because it was the kind of obligation Crito would have understood, and because the practical faithfulness of friends is how the last requests of the dead are honored. What remains across all of it is not a system. Socrates did not build a system. He built a practice. He built a way of being with questions that was patient enough and honest enough that the questions themselves became in his company more clearly visible, their genuine difficulty more apparent, their genuine importance more felt. The person who sat across from Socrates and found their certainty dissolving did not, in most cases, find something better to hold in its place. They found the open ground. They found themselves in a position where the honest answer to the questions they had been carrying was that they did not, after careful examination, know the answers, and that this was not a comfortable discovery, and that Socrates seemed to think the discomfort was the beginning of something rather than the end. He was not always right about this. Not every person who left a conversation with Socrates in a state of genuine aporia went on to inhabit that state with patience and eventually find their way toward better thinking. Some of them left angry and stayed angry. Some of them found the open ground intolerable and filled it again as quickly as they could with the first belief that came to hand. This is what human beings often do with the space that genuine questioning opens. They find it too exposed, too cold, too lacking in the shelter that certainty provides, and they rebuild. There is no shame in this. The shelter is real. The need for it is real. What Socrates questioned was not the need, but the belief that the shelter one had built was more solid than it was. The hemlock he drank was a compound of water dropwort, or poison hemlock, administered in a measured dose, calibrated to produce numbness from the extremities inward, slowly enough to allow the person dying to describe the progress of the sensation. It took perhaps an hour. The entire time Socrates remained, by Phaedo's account, himself, present, attentive, occasionally commenting, his voice unchanged. The body was the thing that was changing. The voice was the same voice. Long after the cell was empty, long after the body had been attended to, and the friends had dispersed into the Athenian afternoon, and the city had continued about its business as cities do, the questions remained in the air, the way certain things remain in a room after the people who inhabited it have gone, not as presences exactly, but as a quality of the light, an inclination in the silence, something that makes the space feel different from spaces where such things have not happened. The question about piety rested where Euthyphro left it, on the steps of a courthouse that still stood. The question about courage rested in the space between the laches, and anyone who has ever tried to say clearly what distinguished the courageous act from the reckless one. The question about justice rested in the ongoing argument between Thrasymachus and everyone who has ever believed that strength is not its own justification. The question about knowledge rested between the craftsman's genuine skill and his confident opinions, between what anyone knows and what they merely believe they know, between the examined belief and the one that has not yet been examined and sits comfortable and unquestioned at the center of a life. The question Socrates asked most persistently, in one form or another, was the question about the good. Not what is useful, not what is pleasurable, not what is approved, but what is genuinely good. Good in a way that would survive the most careful examination a person could bring to bear on it. Good in a way that would not dissolve under questioning, the way every confident answer he was given eventually dissolved. He died without a final answer to this question, which is one of the things about him that is most honest. He did not construct a system that would protect the question from further examination by appearing to have answered it. He left it open. He left it working. The coldness rose from his feet to his legs to his chest. The cloak covered his face. The last words went out into the spring air of Athens and were heard by the people in the room, and remembered and written down and read by people who were not yet born on the day they were spoken, and are still being read now, in the same state of careful uncertainty in which everything Socrates ever said or asked seems finally to arrive, not as an answer, not as a system, but as an invitation to look more carefully at something one had been carrying without examination, something that matters more than it seemed to, something that will still be there in the morning, patient and open, waiting with the unhurried quality of a question that has nowhere else to be. The arguments about the soul, whether they are sound, whether they establish what they set out to establish, whether the soul is the kind of thing that can be argued about in this way, remain, like everything else Socrates touched, unresolved in the deep sense. The best philosophers since have not agreed. The arguments from opposites and affinity and recollection and life's essential nature have been examined and pressed and found to have places where the reasoning meets resistance, just as every argument Socrates made in his lifetime met resistance, and just as the resistance was always treated as an invitation to think more carefully rather than a defeat. Whether the soul continues is not known. Whether the questions continue is not a matter of doubt. They continue in the mind of anyone who has ever sat quietly with one of them